There were seven. A 1967 MGB GT in Old English white, which was my father's, which I bought back off a bloke in Redditch in 1994, with the sills rotted through and the floor pan gone. A 1971 Mercedes 280 W114 chassis, the coupe, in that dark green they only did for about 2 years. A 1968 Datsun Fairlady Roadster, left-hand drive, came out of Bangkok, had been sat under a tarpaulin behind a rice mill in Nakhon Pathom for 11 years. A 1974 Volkswagen Type 2, bay window, 11 window, bought in Lampang off a family who'd used it as a shop. A 1979 Toyota Land Cruiser FJ40, original, numbers matching, the best one I ever had. A 1972 Alfa Romeo GT Jr., off an Italian bloke in Phuket who was going home and cried when he handed me the keys, which at the time I thought was a bit much. And a 1965 Mercedes 190, Ponton. Found it in a shed in Lampang with a chicken living in it. That's the collection. 40 years of my life, 6 of them in Thailand, and every single one of those cars I took apart and put back together with my own hands. They were sold in 19 days while I was in Birmingham burying my sister. Now, I'm going to tell you this properly and in order, and I'm going to keep my voice level, because I've had 14 months of people telling me I need to let it go, and I've found that the ones who say that are the ones who've never owned anything they made. I'm not going to cry on camera. I'm 69, and I did my crying in a workshop in Hangdong in April 2025, and it lasted about 40 minutes, and it's not coming back. What I've got instead is a list, and the list is very specific, and I've been over it enough times that I could recite it in my sleep. Right. Me, Dennis, 69, born in Small Heath, Birmingham, 1957. Left school at 15, apprenticed at a Roots dealership, got my ticket, worked as a fitter for 11 years, and then opened my own place in Tyseley in 1986. 31 years I ran that garage, general mechanical, MOTs, and from about 1997 onward the classic work, which started as a sideline and ended up being about 60% of the turnover. I was known for it. Not nationally. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was famous. But if you had a British car from between 1955 and 1980, and you lived within 40 miles of Birmingham, somebody would eventually tell you to take it to Dennis. I'm a good mechanic. That's not bragging. That's a fact about a trade. And it's the only thing in my life I've ever been certain about. I can hear a bearing going from the other side of a workshop. I've built engines that are still running 25 years later. There's a Healy I did the bodywork on in 2003 that won a class at a national show in 2019, and the owner rang me to tell me, and I sat in the office and had a cup of tea about it. Sold the business in 2017, 60 years old. The lease was up, the landlord wanted to develop, and the honest truth is my back had gone, and I couldn't do a full day under a car anymore. Business and premises goodwill, tools, plant, and the house in Acox Green, £280,000 after everything, plus the state pension coming at 66, and a small private one, about $400 a month. Divorced from Sheila in 1998. Amicable enough by the end, though it wasn't at the time. One son, Wayne, 44, lives in Perth, Western Australia, and we speak about twice a year, and that's nobody's fault, that's just how it turned out. Thailand was a fluke, complete fluke. In 2016, a customer of mine, bloke called Sid, had a stag I'd been keeping alive for a decade, retired to Chiang Mai, and started sending me photographs. Not of beaches, of cars. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Thailand has a classic car scene, and it is extraordinary. There is stuff in this country that would be rotted to nothing anywhere in Northern Europe. Dry, warm, no salt on the roads, no MOT culture chewing through old vehicles. Families that keep things for 30 years because they still work. There are 1970s Land Cruisers sat in villages in Chiang Mai that have never seen a winter. There are Mercedes saloons in Bangkok that were run by government ministries and garaged their whole lives. Sid sent me a photo of a Datsun Fairlady in a barn in October 2016, and I looked at it for about 4 days and then I booked a flight. I moved in March 2018. 61 years old, retirement visa through the embassy. 800,000 baht in a Thai bank account in my own name, which I have maintained every year without fail, because the one thing a tradesman understands is that paperwork the government wants is paperwork you do. Remember that sentence. It comes back. I took a house in Hang Dong, which is the southern side of Chiang Mai, out past the ring road, quiet, agricultural, and crucially, it had a proper outbuilding. Concrete floor, 3-phase power, roller door. Rented, 22,000 baht a month, from a Thai family who thought I was mad and who were, over 7 years, unfailingly decent to me. I brought one car with me, the MGB. Let me tell you what that cost, because people don't believe it, and it's the single most useful thing I can tell anyone thinking about doing this. Thailand's import duty on a used vehicle is punitive. It is deliberately punitive. It is layered. Customs duty, then excise, then interior tax, then VAT, each one calculated on the running total, and the effective rate on a private used import lands, somewhere north of 200% of the assessed value. And the assessment is not your valuation, it's theirs. Shipping, agent, duty, and registration on that MGB came to just under 1.1 million baht, about 24,000 pounds at the time. The car is worth 18. I paid 24,000 pounds to import an 18,000 pound car because it was my dad's, and if you think that's stupid, then you and I are not going to understand each other for the next hour, and you may as well go now. That's the only one I shipped. Everything else, I bought here. 6 cars over 6 years, and I want to walk you through how you actually buy an old vehicle in Thailand, because the whole of this story lives in that process. Every registered vehicle in Thailand has a registration book. Blue, for a private car. The Thais call it the Lem Tabien. It is a physical booklet. It lives with the vehicle in theory and in the owner's drawer in practice, and it records the vehicle's details, its chassis and engine numbers, its tax history, and, this is the part, the name of the registered owner, along with every previous registered owner, each entry stamped by the Department of Land Transport. That book is the vehicle, not the metal, the book. And here is the thing that I want burned into the head of every foreigner watching this, because it is the exact opposite of everything you have ever been told about owning things in Thailand. A foreigner can own a car in Thailand, outright, freehold, in his own name on the registration book, with no nominee, no company, no Thai spouse, no 30-year lease, no usufruct, no legal gymnastics of any kind. You cannot own land, you know that. Everyone knows that. It's the first thing anybody tells you, and it's on every forum and in every video. But a motor vehicle is not land. A motor vehicle is a chattel, and a foreigner with a valid long-stay visa and a certificate of residence can walk into a land transport office and be entered on that blue book as the registered owner, and that ownership is as good as any Thai citizen's. I knew that. I'd known it since 2018. Sid told me on my second week. Now, the process. To transfer a vehicle, you need the blue book, both parties present, or a signed authorization, ID documents, a certificate of residence for the foreigner, and a fee. It takes a morning at the land transport office on the Chiang Mai Lampang road, or a morning and a half, and there's a queue, and the forms are in Thai. And in a great many private sales in this country, I would guess most, at the lower end, the transfer simply doesn't happen. The seller hands over the book with a signed blank transfer form inside it, and the buyer drives away and never goes near a government office. The car changes hands 3, 4, 5 times, and the name in the book stays the same as it was in 1998. It's normal. It is absolutely normal. Every Thai I know has bought a vehicle that way and thought nothing of it. I bought 6 cars in 6 years, and I completed the registration transfer on 2. The Mercedes 280 and the Alpha. Those 2 are in my name, properly, stamped, because both of those sellers were sticklers and pushed me to do it, and I went along. The other 4, the Fairlady, the VW, the FJ40, and the Ponton, I had the books, I had signed blank transfer forms tucked inside them, and the registered owners were a rice mill in Nakhon Pathom, a shop family in Lampang, a man in Chiang Mai who died in 2019, and a name in Lamphun that I could not read. I want to be very clear about why. It wasn't laziness exactly. It's that I had 140,000 pounds of cars, and a bad back, and a workshop full of jobs. And the land transport office is a morning gone, and my tie is rubbish. And every single time, it was the thing I was going to do next month. Next month for 6 years. That's my fatal flaw, and there it is. A man who would not put a wheel back on a car without torquing the nuts to specification, in sequence, with a calibrated wrench, and who left 4 registration books in a drawer with signed blank forms inside them. I met Sumali in March 2023. Everyone called her Sue. She was 24. She came to the workshop with her uncle, who had a Toyota Hilux with a diff wine, and she translated, and she was quick. Properly quick. The sort of quick where she'd translated the technical thing correctly before I'd finished explaining it. Her family were in second hand. That's the word they use here, and it covers a great deal. Her father and 2 uncles ran a yard out toward San Patong that dealt in furniture, appliances, agricultural equipment, motorcycles, anything with resale in it, and there was a network of cousins and contacts across Chiang Mai, Lamphun, and Lampang that moved goods between them, at a speed I found genuinely impressive. I liked them. I want to say that plainly. Her father was a hard worker who'd built something out of nothing, and I recognized him instantly because he was my dad, more or less, with a different climate. Sue and I started properly in about the July, 66 and 24, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't know what that looked like, and I'm not going to sit here and defend it either. She came to the workshop. She stayed 2 years. And she was interested in the cars, which is the bit that got me, and which is the bit I've had to look at hardest. She learned, that's the truth. She learned to spot a resprayed panel. She learned what a matching numbers car meant and why it mattered. She could tell an original FJ40 grille from a reproduction at 10 feet by the end, and I taught her that myself, standing in that workshop, with a cup of tea in my hand, delighted. I taught her to value my cars. I did that. Nobody made me. I stood there for 2 years running a seminar on exactly what each of those 7 vehicles was worth, and exactly what made it worth that, to a woman whose family bought and sold things for a living. Sid said something in about the middle of 2024. He's a blunt sod, and he'd earned it over 30 years, so I'll give it to you as he said it. He said, "Den, whose name's in the books?" I said, "2 of them are mine, the rest are pending." He said, "Pending." And I said something about the office, and the queue, and my tie. And he said, "Mate, they're not pending. They're not yours." I told him to mind his own business, in about those words. We didn't speak for a month. He came round in September with a gearbox he wanted a hand with, and neither of us mentioned it, which is how men of our age apologize. He was right. He was completely right, and I knew he was right within about 4 minutes of him saying it, and I did nothing. And I want anyone who's ever done that to know that I understand you. I'll give you the list, because everyone in my position ends up with a list, and mine has 6 things on it. She never learned to drive. 2 years, in a house with 7 classic cars and a Honda Jazz for the shopping, and she never once wanted to. I offered, repeatedly. She always had a reason, and the reasons were fine. It never occurred to me that a person can be extremely interested in cars for reasons that have nothing to do with driving them. Her family came to the workshop more than her family had any reason to. Her father twice, an uncle 3 or 4 times. A cousin I'd never met who came with the uncle in January 2025 and walked round the whole shop with his hands behind his back like a man at an auction viewing, which I noted at the time and found flattering. She asked twice about the registration books, both times perfectly casually, both times in the context of me moaning about the land transport office. And both times I said next month. In late 2024, she started asking what things would sell for. Not aggressively, the way anybody interested in a market asks, "What's the FJ worth now? Is the Fairlady going up?" And I answered in enormous detail every single time, because a man who has spent 40 years in a trade will talk about that trade to anyone who lets him, and almost nobody ever lets him. In February 2025, she was away for 5 days at her family's, and came back with a phone that cost about 30,000 baht, and said her father had bought it, and her father may well have. And the 6th one, which isn't a red flag, it's just the truth. She was very good company, and I was 66, and living alone in an outbuilding with 7 cars. And for 2 years there was somebody in the house who was interested in what I did. Every one of the first 5 has an innocent reading, and I gave them all one. And I'd probably give 4 of them the same reading today. My sister Brenda died on the 9th of March 2025. 63. Aneurysm, no warning, found by a neighbor. She'd never married, and there was nobody else. My brother Keith is 74 with a hip, and my son is in Perth. So it was me, and I flew on the 14th of March with a return booked for the 4th of April. 3 weeks. Funeral, house clearance in Kings Heath, probate paperwork, 40 years of a woman's belongings in a semi with a damp problem. I left Sue in the house in Hangdong. Of course I did. She lived there. She'd lived there for 18 months. There was nothing to decide. She drove me to the airport and she cried a bit, and I said, "Don't be daft, 3 weeks. Now, the workshop." The roller door had a padlock and Sue had a key, because she'd had a key for 18 months, and it was where the washing machine was. The registration books, all 7 of them, were in the middle drawer of a steel filing cabinet in the workshop office. The office had a door. The door had a lock. The key to the lock was on a hook next to the door, where it had been since 2018, which I recognize is the single stupidest sentence in this entire account. 4 of those books had a blank transfer form signed by a previous owner tucked inside the cover. I want to tell you what a signed blank transfer form actually is, because I don't think people understand it. It is a piece of paper that says, in effect, "I, the registered owner, hereby transfer this vehicle to whoever fills in the rest of this." It's a bearer instrument. It's a check made out to cash, sitting in a drawer, in a room whose key is on a hook. For the 2 that were properly in my name, the Mercedes and the Alpha, there was no such form. And to transfer those, you'd need my signature and my passport copy and me in a queue at the Land Transport Office. Hold that. It matters later, and it's the only good news in this. I should tell you about Birmingham, because it's 3 weeks of this story, and I've skated over it. It rained the whole time. 21 days, and I think we had 2 dry ones. The funeral was at Robin Hood Crematorium on the 24th of March, and there were 19 people there, which for a woman who'd worked in the same school office for 31 years felt thin, and Keith and I stood outside afterwards in the wet not saying anything. Then 11 days of the house. Brenda kept everything. Every card, every photograph, 4 boxes of our mother's things she'd taken in 1998 and never opened. I found my own school reports. I found a photograph of my dad standing next to the MGB in 1974 outside the house in Small Heath, which I had never seen, and I put it in my jacket pocket and carried it around for the rest of the trip. That photograph was in my jacket on the 6th of April when I stood in the doorway of the workshop and counted to 2. I've still got it. It's the only thing left of that car. The 24th of March, the day of the funeral, is the day the VW and the Ponton went onto a flatbed. I know that because of the phone. Sue used my old phone. I'd given it to her in 2023 when I upgraded, and when she left on the 10th of April, she left it in the kitchen drawer. And I don't believe that was carelessness, because nothing else in that fortnight was careless. I think somebody in that family made a decision that having it was worse than not having it. I gave it to my lawyer, and my lawyer gave it to a man in Chiang Mai who does that kind of work for insurance companies, and it cost me 22,000 baht, and it produced photographs. Photographs of my cars, taken in my workshop between the 18th and the 22nd of March. At the angles you'd photograph a vehicle you were advertising. 3/4 front, interior, engine bay, chassis plate, and a set of numbers in a note. 5 lines, 5 figures, which is where I got the sale prices. 380,000 for the FJ40, written down in a note, in a phone I'd given her as a present. That's how I know. That's the whole of my evidence. And my lawyer's view is that its provenance is arguable enough that a prosecutor wouldn't want to build on it, and I've stopped arguing about that. I got back on the 5th of April 2025 at about 2 in the afternoon. Sue picked me up. She was fine. She was completely, entirely, unremarkably fine. She talked about her cousin's baby the whole way from the airport. I didn't go into the workshop that day. I'd been traveling 20 hours, I'd buried my sister, my back was in bits, and I went to bed at 6 in the evening. I went in on the morning of the 6th. The roller door was up about a foot, which it always was, for the air. I want to describe what I actually did, because it isn't what people expect, and I've thought about why. I stood in the doorway, and I counted. That's all. I counted. Twice, the way you do a stock check. And I got to 2. The Mercedes and the Alpha. And my brain, and I'm being completely honest with you here. My brain's first move was maintenance. It said, he's moved them. Come on's moved them. Come on was a Thai mechanic I used for the machining work who had a bigger unit near San Pa Tong. And there was a version of the world where I'd asked him to store some and forgotten. And I stood in that doorway for probably 90 seconds constructing that version. In detail, with a plausible conversation in it that had never happened. That's what a mind does. It doesn't leap to catastrophe. It builds a shed to hide in. Then I looked at the floor. There were fresh oil spots where the FJ40 had been standing for 3 years. And there were tire marks in the dust going out of the roller door. And there were 4 sets of them. And the dust had been disturbed and then settled again, which takes time. Days. More than days. I went into the office. The door was open. The key was on the hook. The middle drawer had 2 books in it, the Mercedes and the Alpha. And I stood in a workshop in Hangdong at about 7:30 in the morning. And I understood the whole thing at once, in about a second and a half, the way you understand that an engine has thrown a rod. Now, I want to be accurate about the next bit, because I've heard my own story told back to me at a bar in Chiang Mai, by someone who'd heard it third hand, and it had a fight in it, and there was no fight. I did not confront her. Not that morning, not that week. I went into the house. She was making coffee. I said good morning. I drank the coffee. I asked her what she wanted to do about dinner. And then I went back to the workshop and I sat on a stool for about 40 minutes and I cried, which I've mentioned. And then I stopped. And then I got a notebook. Because here's what happens to a man who's spent 31 years diagnosing faults. The feeling comes and it goes, and what's left underneath it is process. You don't fix an engine by being upset about it. You establish what's actually wrong, in order, in writing, before you touch a spanner. The notebook is what I did instead of shouting, and it is the only reason I got anything at all. Chassis numbers. I had every one. 7 of them, in a book I'd kept since 2018, along with engine numbers, color codes, and, because I photograph everything, because I've been doing insurance and restoration documentation my whole career, between 40 and 200 photographs of every single vehicle, dated, including the numbers stamped on the chassis rails. That's not sentiment. That's trade habit. 40 years of it. I photographed the empty floor. I photographed the tire marks. I photographed the drawer with 2 books in it, and the hook with the key on it. And then I waited 4 days, and I want to explain why, because it looks strange. I waited because on the second day I went to see Prassert. Prassert was my neighbor, 70-something, retired from the provincial waterworks, kept fighting cocks he wasn't supposed to keep, and he and I had spent 7 years communicating in a pidgin of about 90 Thai words, 40 English ones, and a great deal of pointing. I liked him enormously, and I'd never once had a conversation with him about anything more complicated than rain. I went round on the 7th of April with a bag of oranges, which is what you do, and I sat on his step, and I asked him, badly, in fragments, with my hands, whether he had seen trucks at my place. And he went very quiet. And then he told me, over about 20 minutes, with his daughter-in-law drafted in halfway through to translate the difficult parts, and she was mortified the entire time. Trucks, yes, 3 occasions. The first was about 10 days after I left, a flatbed, and 2 cars went. Then a week later, another 2. Then a car transporter, a proper one, and the last one, which he described by making a shape with his hands that was unmistakably the FJ40. He said men had come and looked first. Several men, over 2 days, walking round the workshop, and one of them had a phone out taking photographs. And then he said the thing that had been sitting on him for 3 weeks, and that he clearly did not want to say to me. He said he had seen Sue at the noodle place on the corner, the Sunday before I got back, with her uncle, and she had a bag, and she was counting money out of it, onto the table, and it was, he made a gesture, a thickness between finger and thumb. A lot. He said, I think maybe you not know. I think maybe I say wrong. That old man had known for 3 weeks. and had been sick about it, and had no idea in the world how to tell a foreigner that his woman had emptied his shed. I've taken him oranges every Sunday since. He tries to give me eggs. It's an ongoing dispute, so that's the discovery. Not a document, not a phone call from a bank. A 74-year-old man on a step with a bag of oranges, doing the decent thing badly, which is better than most people manage. The 19 days, as I eventually reconstructed them, went like this. 2 days of viewings, around the 21st and 22nd of March. The buyers were people her family knew, or people her family's contacts knew, which in that trade is a network reaching across 3 provinces and moves faster than any dealership on earth. First collection, the 24th, the VW and the Ponton. Second, the 31st, the Fairlady and the MGB. The MGB, my father's car. 24,000 pounds of duty and a rusted floor pan I replaced by hand in 1995. Third, the 2nd of April, 2 days before I flew home, the FJ40, on a transporter, to a buyer in Lampang. 5 cars, 19 days. The Mercedes and the Alpha are still standing in that workshop today because they were registered in my name and there was no signed blank form in the book, and you cannot move a vehicle in that market without the book, and you cannot get a book stamped into a new name without the registered owner or a very good forgery. And forgery is a different order of crime that a second-hand dealer in San Patong is not going to commit for a Mercedes worth 14,000 pounds. 2 out of 7. And the 2 that survived are the 2 where I did one morning of paperwork at the Land Transport Office in 2019 and 2022. That's the whole lesson. That's it. Everything else in this video is context. Now the numbers. And I'd like you to stay with me for these, because they're the part that turned whatever I was feeling into what I've got now. The 5 that went were worth, at fair market, in a proper sale, to the right buyer, with the right documentation. The MGB 18,000 pounds, the Fairlady 26, the VW 22, the Ponton 10, and the FJ40 34, 110,000 pounds. They sold, and I know these figures, and I'll tell you how I know them shortly, for a total of 1,840,000 baht, 41,000 pounds. The FJ40, 34,000 pounds of numbers matching original Land Cruiser, went for 380,000 baht. 8,600 pounds. They weren't sold. That's what I need you to understand, and it's the thing that lives behind my eyes at 4 in the morning. Nobody valued them. Nobody marketed them. Nobody found the right buyer. Nobody put the FJ40 in front of the 2 or 3 people in Southeast Asia who'd have paid proper money for it. They were liquidated, moved fast at trade, through people who buy fridges. 110,000 pounds of irreplaceable machinery converted into 41,000 pounds of cash in 19 days. And I would bet my remaining teeth that Sue did not see all 41 of it either. That's the bit that finished any softness I had left. If she'd made 110,000, I'd still be sat here, but at least it would have been a robbery. This was worse. This was 7 years of my hands being turned into a bag of notes on a table at a noodle shop because nobody in the chain had the faintest idea what they were touching. I confronted her on the 10th of April. Level voice. It took about 4 minutes. She didn't deny it. There was nothing to deny. The floor was empty. She said her father had said it was fine because the cars were not in my name. She said it more than once, and I don't think she was lying about having been told it. And I don't think she believed it either, because the 2 cars they left are the 2 that were in my name, which means somebody in that family checked 7 registration books and understood precisely what they were looking at. Then she said the sentence I've kept. She said, "You never finish the paper. I ask you, you say next month," which is true. She had asked me, twice, that I can recall, in 2024, in a perfectly ordinary way, about the Land Transport Office and when I was going to sort it. I've thought about whether those questions were reconnaissance. I've decided it doesn't matter. She asked. I said next month. And next month is where the whole 110,000 pounds went. She left that afternoon. Her uncle came for her things in a pickup and would not look at me. And I stood in the yard and watched and said nothing. And that's the last I saw of her. I went to the police on the 14th of April with a Thai lawyer, a translator, my notebook, 400 photographs, and 7 chassis numbers. I want to be fair about how that went, because there's a certain kind of video that would tell you the police laughed at me, and that is not what happened. The officer who took it was thorough and about 35, and he went through my documentation properly. Theft is theft in Thailand, as it is anywhere, and a foreigner is entitled to file a complaint, and mine was accepted and recorded. Then he explained the problem. And the problem was the same problem I'd already worked out on a stool with a notebook. For 5 of those vehicles, the registered owner in the government's own book was not me. It was a rice mill, a shop family, a dead man in Chiang Mai, and a name in Lampang. My evidence that I owned them consisted of cash transactions with no receipts, because that's how the trade works, possession, which I no longer had, and my own word. The person who sold them had lawful physical access to the premises and had lived there for 18 months. There was no break-in, no forced lock, no forged signature, because none of the 4 needed one, because I had left signed blank transfer forms in the books. He said, through the translator, something that I have not been able to put down. He said, "Sir, on the paper, you are a man who is upset that somebody sold their own cars." Not true. Completely, morally, factually not true. And on the paper, exactly right. I sat in that station for 4 hours, and I want to describe one particular 10 minutes of it, because it's the 10 minutes that turned the whole thing cold in me for good. He asked me for receipts. Reasonable question. First question anybody would ask. I bought the Fairlady in 2019 for 420,000 baht in cash, in a yard in Nakhon Pathom, from a man whose name I knew, and whose address I did not, and what I got was a handshake, a set of keys, and a book with somebody else's name in it. That's not unusual, and it's not shady. That is the ordinary transaction in that market, conducted the same way 10,000 times a week across this country. The VW, same. The Ponton, same. The FJ40 I paid for in 3 installments, and I've got the bank transfers for 2 of them, and the third was cash. So there I was, a man who ran a VAT-registered business for 31 years and never once failed an inspection, sitting in a police station in Chiang Mai, unable to prove I had ever owned a single one of 5 vehicles. That's the cost of everybody does it that way here. That sentence is true, and it is fine, right up until the exact moment it isn't. And at that moment, it converts 110,000 pounds into a story you're telling a stranger. The complaint went nowhere. Not because anyone was corrupt or lazy. I want that on record. Nobody asked me for a single baht, and the officer rang me twice, unprompted with updates. But because a prosecutor looks at that file and sees an evidential hole you could drive a Land Cruiser through. But something did come out of it, and it's the reason I've got anything to show you at all. Chassis numbers. A vehicle in Thailand cannot be legally re-registered, taxed, or insured without its number being entered into the Department of Land Transport system. Those 5 cars were sold to people who wanted to use them, and people who want to use a car eventually put it through a system. My lawyer filed inquiries against all 5 chassis numbers. It took months, and it cost me about 90,000 baht in fees. And 3 of the 5 have never surfaced, and I expect never will. They'll be sat in barns, or parted out, or running on the old registration for a decade the way half the vehicles in this country do. But in November 2025, the FJ40 appeared, registered, taxed, in Lampang, to a man who had bought it in good faith for 380,000 baht from a dealer in Sampatong, with a book and a signed form, exactly as 10,000 vehicles change hands here every week. He had done nothing wrong. He was not a fence, he was not a party to anything. He was a bloke in his 50s who'd bought a Land Cruiser. And I want to tell you what I did, because this is the end of the story, and it's the only bit I'm not ashamed of. I did not sue him. I could have tried. My lawyer thought there was an argument. I drove to Lampang on the 2nd of December 2025 with a translator, and I knocked on his door, and I showed him 400 photographs of me rebuilding that vehicle between 2019 and 2022. The chassis with the tub off, the axle rebuild, the original grille, me, in the workshop, with my hands in it, and I offered him 420,000 baht. He didn't take it straight away. We sat for about 2 hours, and he asked a lot of questions, and he was, I think, quite badly shaken by the whole thing. His wife made food. At one point, he went and got his own son to look at the photographs. He took 400,000. He would not take more, and when I pushed, he got annoyed about it. And I have thought about that man a great deal since. I bought my own car back for £9,000. It cost me £34,000 worth of car and about £11,000 in legal and travel to get it. And it is sat in that workshop right now, 12 feet from where I'm speaking, next to a Mercedes and an Alfa. 3 out of 7. Right. The useful part. 4 things. And if you own a vehicle in this country, the first one is worth the whole video. 1. You can own a car in Thailand in your own name. Do it. Foreigners spend their entire time here obsessing about land, which they genuinely cannot own, and then completely ignore the one significant asset class, where the law gives them full, unambiguous, freehold ownership, with no structures and no nominees. A vehicle is not land. Get your name in that blue book. It's a morning and a few hundred baht and a certificate of residence. 2. If it's not in your name, you do not own it. Not partly, not morally, not in any sense a police officer can act on. Possession is not ownership in a country with a national vehicle register. And everybody buys cars that way here is true and is completely irrelevant the moment there is a dispute. If you have bought a vehicle and not transferred it, stop what you're doing today and go and transfer it. 3. The book is not a document. It is the asset. Treat it accordingly. Mine were in an unlocked cabinet in a room with the key on a hook, and 4 of them had signed blank transfer forms in them, which is a bearer instrument and which I put there myself. Registration books belong in a safe deposit box at a bank, and if there's a signed blank form in one of yours, take it out and burn it and go and do the transfer properly. 4. Photograph everything and record the numbers. Chassis, engine, dated images, the lot. It's the only reason I ever found the FJ40, and it's the only reason the man in Lampang believed me when I turned up on his doorstep. 40 years of trade habit got me 1 car back out of 5. And a 5th, which is for a specific type of man, and I think he's watching. Before that, one thing that isn't practical. I'm not going to tell you I've made peace with it. I haven't, and I don't intend to. What I've got instead is colder than that, and it works better. I know exactly what happened and exactly why. It wasn't fate, and it wasn't Thailand, and it wasn't, in the end, even really her. She was 24, and her family bought and sold things, and I spent 2 years teaching her what mine were worth, while a drawer full of signed forms sat behind a door with the key on a hook. I did that. If you're a tradesman, a mechanic, a builder, a sparks, a joiner, anybody who's spent their life being competent with their hands, you have a blind spot, and it is exactly the one that got me. We are meticulous about the work and contemptuous of the office. That's the culture. 40 years I watched blokes in my trade do beautiful, precise, uncompromising work and then lose money because they never chased an invoice, never got a job sheet signed, never registered a vehicle they'd taken in part exchange. I did it myself with the VAT for 2 years in the 90s, and it nearly cost me the business. The paperwork isn't separate from the work. It's the part of the work that decides whether the work was yours. I torqued every nut on those cars to specification, because doing it by feel is what amateurs do. And I left 4 registration books in an unlocked drawer with signed blank forms in them. And if you'd shown me that as a diagnostic problem on somebody else's premises, I'd have identified it in 4 seconds and been rude about it. Being brilliant at the thing is not the same as being safe. It might be the opposite, because it gives you somewhere to put your attention that feels like diligence. Right, that's everything. I'm 69. I've got £131,000, 3 cars, a workshop in Hangdong, and a neighbor who keeps trying to give me eggs. The MGB's gone, and it isn't coming back, and my father has been dead since 1991, and that particular thing is finished. I've got a photograph of him standing next to it in 1974, in the rain outside a house in Small Heath, and that photograph was in my jacket pocket when I counted to 2, and it's on the wall of the office now, above the filing cabinet, which has a proper lock on it, and the key is not on a hook. But that Land Cruiser is 12 feet from me. It needs a wheel cylinder, and the seat vinyl's gone brittle on the driver's side, and I've got the parts on order from a bloke in Osaka. I'll do the transfer on Thursday. I've booked the morning off.